the 1st of Sivan. Chodesh Tov Mavorach, everybody. Only a few more days until Shavuot, the reenactment, receiving of the Torah at Har Sinai, which is actually what, speaking of which, we're going to be discussing today in the Kitab Al-Qazar in the Kuzari. Now, let me just share the screen again, and I will recap what we covered last week. Last week, better if I look at my own book. Last week, Kuzari asks a question or challenges the Haber. And why don't we just read really quickly what he said? Oh, give me one moment. I'm so sorry. Just one moment. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, he says here, Kuzari said, someone who hears you say that God spoke with your people, that he wrote tablets for them, and other such anthropomorphisms, will conclude that you believe in a physical God. It would seem that you could not condemn such a person, because no one can dispute the great physical revelations of God that you just mentioned. And even though a physical God does not seem logical, it would still be correct for you to reject the philosopher's path of arriving at a religion through proofs and intellectual analysis, since your historical revelations supersede all else. So basically, what is the Kuzari saying here? He's challenging the Haber, who's been telling him for the past few paragraphs, sorry about saying that, that everything that happened was a physical reality, and that it's etched in the memory, the national memory of Am Yisrael. So the challenge then is, well, your God must be physical. Everything you've described took place in the physical world. Just as if I want to write a paragraph on a piece of paper, I cannot write a paragraph through sheer will alone, but I have to take my hand to grab the pen, to dip it in the, well, not anymore, but just to grab the pen and write on the page. And that's how I've interacted with the world. So therefore, there must be some sort of physical apparatus and with which our God manipulates and interacts in our world. And of course, the Kuzari is asking this question to set up a theological challenge for ourselves, and a theological challenge that was very prevalent between the schools of Andalusia and Catalonia. Last week I mentioned that Harambam in his 13 Ikarim, his 13 Yesodot, I should rather say, his 13 principles of faith, he concludes that God has he does not have a body or no resemblance of anybody, of a body. And because of that, many of the Hachamim in Andalusia, many of the Hachamim in Catalonia went to war with Harambam. One such being the Ra'avad. The Ra'avad criticizing Rambam's strong language in saying that a person who believes that God has a body has no share in the world to come. And how dare he? How dare you, Rambam, come along and tell us, Hachamim, who are greater than you and have been more tradition than you, who believe in such things, that we have no share in the world to come. So here we could see that same mistake or that same idea was prevalent here, and this is what Yehuda Halevi is going to address right here: the anthropomorphisms and what else, and what we're encountering in the Torah and in our story. Does this indicate the physicality of God? And notice here he says, it doesn't say it in the, I don't think he says it in the original text. I'm gonna just look. Yeah, I don't see it. But here it says, and even though a physical God does not seem logical, and what does that mean? Logical in the sense that it doesn't line up with the way we would, in the way Greeks relate to this beyond God. And he's right. A physical God is not a logical conclusion. But he's saying that because our experience is greater than any logic, meaning that what we experienced is going to be more demonstrative for what we are going to be believing, rather than kind to think and what would God be like. He's saying that it still provides some sort of stumbling block for him. Yes, you're on.
Well, that's a very old way of looking at physicality. So I would say that for me, God is very physical. Like I see God in a rainbow, I see Him all over the place. And energy today equals matter, according to Einstein. There is a formula. So the fact that we don't see goof and partouf the way we see you on Zoom doesn't mean that God is not.
Yes, go ahead. We lost you for a second. You're on me there?
Yes.
Oh, we lost you. We lost you at the very end. Did you?
Well, I just said that the fact that God doesn't have a face and a body the way we see each other doesn't mean that God has no physicality. I see God in nature as a for example, and He doesn't have to be in one place like we have to be in one place because of our limitation. Because God has no limitation, I could see God, in various parts of nature. For me, other people can see God in shul. Everybody can see God in a different way. But to me, God is physical.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I think we brought this up last week also, and the idea of it not being, when we say physical, we mean not just a physical body. Let's see here. I'm looking here. מהיסוד השלישי, שליל הגשמיות ממנו, והוא שזה אינו גוף, ולא כוח בגוף, ולא יראו מהירות הגופים, כגון עוד מנוחה. ולא באמסם ולא במקרה. What Harambam is writing down here isn't that it's just the physical shell of something. Sound waves don't have physical bodies, but sound waves have, you can detect sound waves. There's a physical reality to the sound waves still. Same thing with light. Light is made up of particles and waves. These are physical realities that exist in our physical universe. That's not what we mean when we say God doesn't have a body. We don't mean that he's like a particle or a wave or like microwaves or like anything like that. What we mean is that he has no semblance of a physical body either. He doesn't have a quantifiable presence in mathematical terms, in scientific terms. However, that doesn't mean that he's any less real. Like you're saying, you can see God in nature. And that's exactly what the Hachamim suggest how a person comes to have Ahavat Hashem, is to go out and experience nature, see the rainbows. And these are what the Berachot are for. The Berachot are there to help us inculcate that awe that we feel when we see, when we encounter this divine. It doesn't mean here though, like, just like radio waves exist and I can use a radio to pick up the radio wave, and that's still a semblance of physicality. And that's what Harambam here is encoding, writing down, I should rather say, in the Yesod HaShlishi here when he says that he doesn't have any sort of physical attributes to him whatsoever. So we're here then is, well, then how does God interact in our world then? If there's no even hint of physicality, like light can interact in our world because it has particles and waves, and we can pick up on those. So how do we pick up on that? So the Haber responds to the king of the Khazars, the King Kuzari, and he says, Halil, Halila, la'el min hashakir v'shavo b'torah ma hal merchik oto v'yishmihu shakir. God forbid that such a thing could ever be ascribed to him, meaning the physicality. Never does the Torah write something that logic dictates as false. And I remember this is what we left off with last week to think about. What are we talking about here? The Torah never dictates something that logic the Torah never writes something that logic dictates as false. It does seem, you could say, well, there are many things in the Torah that logic would say is false. What about the miracles? What about the splitting of the sea? What about prophecy? What about all these things that we're going to be encountering that we see that we go, that doesn't seem to make any sense. We're going to talk about that in a paragraph or two, but I just wanted to throw out that question right now, that when we talk about when the Torah never says something that's false, or never against logic rather, that we have to understand again that the logic we're talking about is the logic of how the universe works. The Torah will never tell you that there's such a thing as a round square. There's no such possibility. That doesn't jibe with our logical rules, and so that's what it's talking about here. He's going to explain why the Torah never it doesn't agree with what he just said. So he says, to it, the first of the 10 commandments is to believe in God. The second prohibits the worship of gods in addition to God, and making idols and graven images which represent God. The result of the first two then is a prohibition of attributing any physicality to God. So this is very interesting what he's doing here. He's taking the first two statements of the Decalogue, and he's saying that this teaches us that we are not allowed to ascribe any physicality to God, because we're not allowed to worship other gods. We're not allowed to make idols, graven images, anything that would result in some sort of portrayal in a physical way of our deity. It's prohibited. I'd like to point out, I don't think he points it out here, but are there exceptions to this rule of making graven images, statues in Judaism? We might have mentioned it last week in something that disappeared and never came back.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I may be wrong, but I thought at one point when Adam was being formed, we were told he was being made in the image of God.
Yes.
But perhaps it's not the physical image, but the image of I'm trying to think of what's in his mind, what he should do as a person.
Yes, I think if I understand what you're saying, like more of the intellectual capabilities of God,
Right.
rather
right.
than physical form.
But and obviously they are greatly reduced from what God can do.
Right. What that means, that Tselem Elohim, and that's a good point. We're saying physical. It sounds like we're saying the physical image of God. And Rambam gives a very good explanation in his first chapter of the Guide for the Perplexed of what we mean by Tselem versus what would be the other Timuna versus a likeness. Tselem is sort of like the muscle of free will, so to speak, in humanity. It's what distinguishes a human being from an animal, and it's because it gives us the potential to choose our actions, to choose one action over another one, and say, I'm not going to do that one, as opposed to having like a base instinct that makes our actions for us. That's what the actualization of what a tselem is. We're able to choose to neglect something that we really want to do, and something that we feel is more humane. For example, an animal, you can train an animal to not eat food in front of it, but you have to really train it. A person can choose and decide, I don't want to eat that thing. And this Tselem Elohim, that's what the Torah is coming to strengthen. The Torah is like a workout regimen for the muscle of free will. It's the gym for the soul, so to speak. It's supposed to make us more in the image of God, but that image is the ability to choose. It's not what we physically look like. It's what our soul is. What our soul is patterned after, I would say. Thank you for that.
I have another question. You were saying
Sure.
that there's nothing in the Torah that can't be, explained.
Mhm.
What about the donkey, speaking? And what about some of the other miracles? Those, I
Exactly.
know actually that, people are saying that the crossing of the Red Sea and the 10 plagues, those can all be explained as physical happenings. Scholars have written about that.
Mhm.
But I don't know if anybody's talked about the donkey unless we're thinking that maybe there was a ventriloquist in the in the area that made the donkey speak.
That's very, very good. I want to point out something here, and I really lament my lack of ability to actually speak this language, because it is a very packed language here. I'm going to share the Safaria screen real quickly. The Safaria screen, this is the text of on the left here, we have the text of the Kuzari in Judeo-Arabic, and here is a more dated translation of it in English. The language, the word that the Kuzari is using for logic is this word right here, al-aql. Aql is the rational side of our brain, how we relate to our reality. The aql was a big buzzword in the Mutazila school of thought in the Islamic world, and it had to do with Islamic interpretation of Aristotelian logic, and the word that they used for that was aql. So here he's saying that the Torah will never come to challenge the aql. The aql is, there's a very famous question, I think, that's asked, you might know, can God create a rock so heavy that even he cannot lift it, right? And that's a question that is like, well, if God is all powerful, then of course he can create a rock that he cannot lift. But wait a minute, if he's all powerful, how can he not lift it? It's a semantic riddle of whether or not God is omnipotent or not. The real question that's being asked is, can God be powerless? As far as I'm concerned, I don't think it's a hard question. I think the language we speak tricks us into thinking that it's a difficult question. But I really think that no, the question is, can God be powerless? And I don't think that, no, of course not, because it's like asking, can purple be black? Can ice cream be tall? I don't know, maybe that one could work out. It doesn't conform to the logical dictates of our brain. A circle cannot be round. No, excuse me, a square cannot be round. If it became round, it would no longer be a square. It would lose the properties that makes it that thing. A property of God is that he is omnipotent. Let's go with omnipotent for now. If he were to limit his power in some way, that would God not being God. So that's what I think the Torah, what Yuhad Levi is saying here. Not there are fantastical stories in the Torah and that cannot be explained by logic. There's anything in the Torah that we see, and this is how Rambam's approach most of the time, is that if you cannot accept it the way it's happening, you don't have to accept it that way. You have to understand what it's telling you. So the good example that you brought up was the donkey speaking to Bilam. So in the way we can understand that, instead of it being a aberration of nature, we understand it as it being either a prophecy, that Bilam was having a prophecy, he was receiving a message from God in a dream, and because it's dream logic, anything can happen. Another way of understanding that is, let me open up to Pirkei Avot here. Actually, no, we have Sefaria right here. Pirkei Avot. Let's just bear with me for a moment. It would be in Mishnah. It would be in Gin Avot. It would be chapter 5. It would be Halakha Dalid. Here. Well, they make it Shesh. Okay, Halakha 6. Let me put it in. There you go. And we mentioned this last week too, but there's something, this is a Mishnah very much worth examining again. Asara devarim nivra'u ba'erev Shabbat ben Hashem Ashoth. There were 10 things that were created on Erev Shabbat, on Friday, the 6th day of creation, right before God said, I'm done for the day, right? And these are these ve'elohan, these are the things. Piha aretz, u'piha be'er, u'piha aton. These three things here, the piha aretz, the piha be'er, and the piha aton, these are fantastical aberrations of nature, so to speak, it seems. The piha aretz is the mouth that opens up with Korach. When Korach and his whole company are challenging Moshe Rabbeinu, the mouth opens up and swallows Korach and his whole company, and it shows that God is choosing Moshe Rabbeinu. The Piha Be'er is the well that follows Miriam through the desert for 40 years, or it really follows the Israelites, but it's in Miriam's merit. So when Miriam passes away, the well stops up. So that's miraculous. And the Piha Athon, that is the mouth of the female donkey that Bilam rides. So why are the Hachamim including these things in the Ma'aseh Bereshit, in the original formulation of creation? So Harambam's explanation is that it's because these are part and parcel of nature. This is the logical formula that nature works by. Because God put it into the creation, this was part of it since the beginning. The problem with that is, and I'm not trying, I don't know more than Harambam, don't get me wrong, is that it seems to take away the free will of Korah, for example, with the Piha Aretz. How did there's a lot of free will things in there, and I just might need to re-examine it, what exactly is happening there. But we have other creations here as well that aren't seemingly supernatural. We have the Haman, the man is supernatural, but Hakeshet, the rainbow, that is the rainbow. This is in reference to the rainbow that Noah sees after he exits the ark. Were there no rainbows beforehand, and now after the flood there are rainbows? Some would say yes, and that the reality of the planet changed, and before, when water and light mixed, there wasn't a ability for rainbows to form because of the humidity or lack of humidity, however you want to say it. And afterwards, after the flood, the physical nature of the world changed. Okay, yeah, we can have rainbows now. I don't know if I agree with that exactly either. But then you have other things like the mate, that's just a staff. You have the shamir, that's a worm. These are things that are apparent in nature. And I'm not sure I have a grasp entirely on what this Mishnah is teaching us, because this Mishnah has a lot encoded into it. The hakatav v'machtiv, excuse me, the katav v'mechtav, these are language faculties, and that seems to jive with like what the Hachamim would say, that there are like the way that we interact with each other via language that comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu itself. But you can see from this Mishnah that some people would understand this Mishnah is teaching us that no, the miracle of the donkey was encoded into the logic of nature, so to speak. So it's not it's a program that was there, that was waiting for the right moment, and then when the right moment came, the program functioned the way it was supposed to, and there was no abrogation of nature. I like to look at it instead as it was a prophecy, it was a dream that Bilam received, and that's what he was seeing there instead. But yeah, what faith is not supposed to dictate. Yeah. Faith should not be dictating our logic. And our logic and our faith, so to speak, should be meshing together and understanding the world in a certain way. Our faith should be a byproduct of our experience, rather than a blind allegiance that we're not aware of. It's the difference between, I would say, our faith and the Christian faith. The Christian faith, you have to take this leap. There's a leap of faith you have to take. My logic doesn't get there, but I'm going to believe, and hopefully I get there. Rather with us, what the rabbis are teaching us over and over again is that emunah, faithfulness, we are faithful to Kadosh Baruch Hu and to his Torah because of our experiences with him and because of our knowledge of him. And that's what I think. The Kuzari is trying. The Haber is trying to teach us there in that piece. Does that help? Does that explain or?
Yeah, it does help. I have one other question. Can you
Yeah.
tell us again what the shamir is?
So the shamir is a special worm, or maybe it's not so special. It's a worm that when we were building, so we're not allowed to use metal tools on the stones.
Yeah. Right.
So how do you cut these stones then so you can make them for, so you can build the temple? So what Solomon did, and this is a very interesting midrash, is he went to the prince of the demons, and he acquired from them this special worm that would help them cut the stones. And again, this midrash has a lot of encoding in it. It has to be decoded properly. But the worm, basically what the shamir would do is it would move along the stone, and it would kind of like break the stone where it moved. So you could cut the stones with the shamir without using a metal tool. The thing is that a metal tool is only not allowed to be used on the Temple Mount. You can quarry the stones with metal outside the Temple Mount, which is what they did. And that's what it describes in the Mikra, in the Tanakh. And they quarried the stones outside, and then they brought the blocks to the Temple Mount and built them. My idea is that the shamir was really used for the engraving of the breastplate, because it's a very intricate little designs that they were putting on the breastplate that the Kohen Gadol would wear. And for that, they used the shamir. There are many ideas, what was it? Was it a worm that must have left some sort of acidic trail? And there are archaeologists who think that they find the shamir every once in a while, that there's this worm that left some sort of burning trail, and they would use that to break the stones easier. But it's unclear what exactly it was. Harambam says it's one thing in the Mishnah. He says it's something else in the guide. But I haven't seen that myself, so I couldn't speak to that more.
So the word shamir is the same name as one of the prime ministers, that, shamir, it's the same thing.
It's say that one more time.
One of our prime ministers of Israel was a shamir.
Was he? Hold on, who was it?
I'm trying to think.
That went after begging.
It was after Begin. We had oh, you're right. Yeah, I guess so. That was, yeah. I never, for whatever reason, I never put the two together in my mind. But that's exactly, yeah. That's exactly
so his
right.
name was the same as that then.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for explaining it.
Of course. Let's finish the first paragraph here. We already finished the first paragraph. We have a few more minutes, and then we'll let me share the screen again. Yes, go ahead, Yoram.
Well, to me, to understand a donkey is not a big deal. There is communication, and most of us are tuned off. God communicates constantly, 24/7. And most of us busy with other things, which means we don't receive the communication.
Right. No, yeah. Absolutely. There's constant speech of God that's happening in the Bria.
All the enemies. So communicate. Your dog or your horse communicate. And most of us are just tuned off.
No, yeah, you're right. God is constantly communicating. The speech of God is constantly being spoken in the universe. It's one of the things that is become apparent, I think, as we move on and understand what is speech of God. It's something we keep coming back to, and we touch on, and we see it from a different perspective. We'll touch on it in this next paragraph, or actually in this big paragraph. I don't know if we'll touch it in the sub-paragraph we're going to read, but we're going to touch on that exactly. Thank you. Okay, so we're talking about not attributing. We don't attribute any physicality to God. So the Haber is going to bring us something else. How could we not elevate God above the physical? if we can elevate certain creatures of God above the physical. So he's saying, of course, whenever we talk about God's physicality, we have to understand it in terms of it being a parable, a metaphor. And of course, we can definitely elevate God above the physical, because we elevate physical creatures even above the physical. And this is his example. Consider a person's soul, which is really the essence of every person. This is something we were touching on a little bit with the Tselem, but we're getting deeper than that. And like, what is the soul exactly? He's talking about we elevate humanity above the physical whenever we talk about the person's soul. When, for example, Moshe would speak, instruct, and lead us, what emerged from him did not emanate from his tongue or his heart or his brain. Those were just tools that Moshe's soul used to speak to us. The entity called Moshe then is the speaking, discerning soul. And this isn't only true of Moshe Rabbeinu, this is true of every human being. He's just using Moshe Rabbeinu as an example. He's not saying that Moshe Rabbeinu was special in this regard. This is every human being, but he's using just him as an example. It's not physical, nor confined to a certain place, nor does it take up any space, nor is it ever filled to capacity by all the images in the world that may enter into it. My idea is that here he's also using the old idea of soul being a little bit related to the akel, but I need to look more into that. And remember, the akel is the Arabic word for the intellect. We even ascribe celestial qualities to the soul, meaning the soul lives on, the soul is eternal, the soul, it comes from heaven, eternal. This is beyond anything physical, this is beyond anything human. How much more so then do we elevate God above the physical? So if we're going to elevate the essence of humanity above the physical realm, of course, we are going to elevate God above the physical realm in reality. What is the reality of God? And just like Moshe Rabbeinu has a hand and he has a heart and a mouth, that God that allows him to physically interact with the world, God also has ways in which he can physically interact with the world. They're not a hand, they're not a mouth, but they're other means. The God is not bound by any of those limitations. Why don't we end here for today before we get into subparagraph 3, because that is going to be a bit of a longer discussion. Are there any other questions before we end for today? Yoram, please.
Yeah, I'm kind of meditating on the Tselem Elohim because I haven't figured it out yet totally. But the best thing I could come at this point in time, we had two things. We have a free choice, and obviously God have a choice. Whatever God does is a free choice. Number two, animals have chokhmah and binah, which is knowledge, but we also have that, which is consciousness, which is distinguishing between good and bad. If we believe in our theology, God is only good. God doesn't do anything that is bad. We may not like the manifestation of God action, like your kids don't like when you ground them and you don't give them the ice cream before they go to sleep, or you tell them brush your teeth or else. God actions are always good, but we human at least got the tools to know the difference between good and evil, which is really like the Etz Hadat, knowing between God told us, and that's good. Sometimes we choose to deviate, and that's typically not good. May have consequences, either immediately, over time, or in the next world. God always does good, so he doesn't need the extra tool.
So you were saying that relates to Tselem Elohim?
Tselem, by definition, is not identical. Tselem means we have aspects of Hashem, some aspects, and you can pick up anything you like. Clearly, our power is limited.
Clearly, we are limited by space and time, and God is not. But God always chooses good. We have an option to choose good or evil.
Mhm.
If we choose good all the time, which only Tzaddik Gamur does, and even Avotenu were not perfect. King David was far from being perfect. Abraham did some nasty things to his son Ishmael. Jacob was cheating his father. So these were the greatest people in our history, and they got perfection. They had a lot of good things. And we have the choice not to be perfect, but to strive for perfection and move on our character traits to be better, hopefully all the time.
Right. Thank you. We'll continue. Actually, I'm not sure if we'll actually continue next week because it'll be right after Shavuot, and usually after the day after a holiday, I'm a little sluggish. I mean, I'm sluggish today because I'm not feeling so well myself. But like next week, I'm debating whether or not to have it. I'll let everybody know before that, of course, before Shavuot comes in, if we'll be
Do we
having
have
it.
your, by the way, classes on Tuesday? Because I haven't sent my announcement,
No, we
but
do not have class
so we
Tuesday.
don't have
It'll be
classes.
Shavuot. Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts, comments, questions, concerns?